Hello, good evening, and welcome back to Rogue Reviews. As you can see, we're still slightly in Christmas mood, which is absolutely lovely. Tonight, you are joining us for episode 2 of season 2, which is episode 12 in total. Tonight, we're going to be looking at Chrononauts. Right, let's get on with the game, shall we? So what is Chrononauts? Well, Chrononauts was developed by the absolutely fantastic Looney Labs, and this is a beautifully simple and yet wonderfully complicated game about basically travelling back and forth into time across the whole of the 20th century to rearrange time to suit you till you can return home. Because you see, are a missing time traveller cast out of your own time in a future time or past time beyond which you do not know. The whole point is that history is not as it should be for you. So you need to go and reorganize events so that you can basically go back in time to the time that fits your own particular timeline. Confused yet? Hopefully not too much. The other way you can succeed is by basically carrying out a secret mission, which will usually involve collecting certain items from the past, such as a videotape of the creation of the universe, tomorrow's news today, or the lost Ark of the Covenant, that kind of thing. There is kind of a charmingly good sense of humour here, as well as actual real historical details. It's quite fascinating to me that this actually taught me and my family basically about certain other elements of popular history that we even didn't know that deeply. So this has actually been an educational game as well as an entertainment one. Now, there are expansion packs available, of which we've bought pretty much all of them. There are the Gore years, which have basically a few more years on to the end of the series. The Lost Identities, which gives you more options to basically play different options, adds replayability to the game. And of course the expansion, which is Early American Chrononauts, which kind of pushes the whole thing a century back into early American history. So we'll get into this more context and look into more detail when we take a closer look at Chrononauts. So let's have a look at Chrononauts in more detail then. Well, the first thing you notice is that the cards are laid out on the board for you, creating a timeline. This timeline stretches, in the base game, from 1865 all the way through to 1999. Though, as I've said, we've basically picked up the further expansion, which takes you into 2000 and beyond. The way that the game is organised is in terms of various events throughout the 20th century. Key events and their effects, therefore, on the rest of the 20th century. For example, Lincoln is assassinated in 1865, and there's a bit of flavor text on there and a certain symbol. Now, what the premise of the game states is that if Lincoln was assassinated, or not assassinated, as the case may be, then events of history would change. For example, specifically, the events of 1974 in this case. So if we look at 1974, Nixon, for example, might not have resigned if, for example, Lincoln had not been assassinated. Also, other events might need to be involved. For example, JFK himself might not need to have been assassinated as well. So let's see what happened there. For example, Kennedy, if he wasn't assassinated, would have been injured, and that would have affected history further in these specific dates. Now, it's a charming way of organising things, really, and it makes you really think about the interconnectedness of history, especially if you're a fan of Douglas Adams and read Dirk Gently's Cursed Detective Agency. So, there are certain key events across the 20th century. These are called linchpins, which are these purple cards. For example, the Manhattan Project. For example, Pearl Harbor was being bombed. For example, Lusitania sank. Also, rather most importantly, where are we? And Hitler opens the 1936 Olympics, or alternatively, Hitler's assassinated. Now, this actually creates the most ripples of anything, which is 5 different events affected by this. And that term ripples is basically used to denote events that will be changed in some form if history went a certain different way. The other cards in these are basically blue. They have sort of representative effects that are determined by these special events. So, for example, if Kennedy wasn't assassinated here, then further people of the Kennedy family would not have met an untimely end also. Therefore, this is paradox, which basically means it cannot happen, which creates kind of a hole in time and space. These can actually be fixed by using the Chrononauts cards. Now this is a variety, this is the draw deck basically, which consists of a whole variety of different cards, which you as a time traveller can find to help you. For example, you may find artifacts including an obvious forgery of the Mona Lisa. You might find a time machine, you might find a live brontosaurus, and you might find patches. These orange cards basically replace the events that would have happened elsewhere. For example, if Hitler sadly met his end, then in 1945, Allied troops might invade Tokyo. For example, let's find some more. If, for example, the Manhattan Project hadn't happened or Sputnik hadn't happened, we might end up with World War III in 1962. Various events can come to place. Now, the way these basically are organised is that you start off with a certain number at the hand at the beginning of the game, and every turn you draw a card and play a card. So the mechanics are very, very simple. But in terms of what they do, there's a huge variety. We mentioned artifacts before. So for example, these green cards are things you might need to collect depending upon your mission. So you start with two things at the start of the game, an ID and a mission. For example, you might be René, the time traveller from 1912. Now, your reality is one in which one event took place as it actually did in our timeline, but two events happened differently. So if you want to win the game, you need to first work out how you can change history in this regard. Now, you need 1929 to happen a different way. You need 1948 to happen a different way. Now, the way that this happens first is that you have to find the linchpins involved. So if you look at 1929 over here, the stock market crashes. Now you're trying to find a specific different event, one of the other orange cards, that would patch this if it becomes paradoxed. So you have to find what happened to affect it. Now in 1912, the Titanic sank. Or did it? If it avoids the iceberg, then later on, it might end up exploding 10 years later. So you would first need to find a card that would change this linchpin. In the deck, these are the yellow cards, which are the inverters. These change history. There are some which are very, very specific, for example, preventing assassination, such as this, or there are some that are more general, for example, just reverse fate. This flips anything from basically the black side to the red alternative side, or back again, and obviously there's various variations on this. So, first you have to basically put a plan in place to flip the linchpin of your choice. Once this happened, it basically affects the timeline as it stands. You then need to collect these orange cards from the deck and patch the one in question that you're after. Now, if you remember, you need to do this twice to fulfill your own particular timeline, and if this happens at the end of the turn, you go home and you win the game. Of course, while you're trying to do this, everybody else is trying to do this at the same time. So let's, for example, you want the Manhattan Project to have been sabotaged because it relies on certain events that in your history mean that you would need to go home. However, somebody else might need the Manhattan Project to remain exactly as it is. So you end up in a battle of basically flipping history back and forth in different ways. There are several very, very funny moments here. Slight frustration at times, but obviously it can be quite hilarious. For example, we're going to kill Hitler. No, we're going to save Hitler. No, we're going to kill Hitler. We're going to save Lincoln. No, we're going to assassinate Lincoln, and back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. I must admit, some of them are more charming than others. We definitely have a few family favourites. So we've talked about the inverters, we've talked about the patches, we've talked about the artifacts. What else? Well, there are these action cards. For example, you could steal an artifact or a gadget, such as a time machine, from a different player. Very, very useful, which basically means you pinch it out of their hand or off the table in front of them. You could basically discard a gadget. So if somebody definitely needs something to win the game and you basically get rid of it, they need to find an alternative source. There are time warp cards, which basically has the power to drag other cards out of the play and use them for yourself. Very, 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 very useful. What else have we got here? There are certain gadgets in play, like we saw the time machine before. These usually let you play extra cards or create other opportunities to basically mess with the other players or give yourself a little bit of advantage. Now, there is a fairly decent mix of all of these. There are lots of different, very, very funny. Seem familiar at all? events and things referred to in different popular history and popular TV and popular movies, etc. These are great fun. So if you wish to reenact your joys of acting out Back to the Future, you can do. If you want fancy listen to the Beatles reunion album, you can do. If you fancy becoming a dinosaur collector, you can be. Now, the basic premise of the game remains the same, but what basically gives it replayability is the different elements in play, the different people you play with, how they play. So, what might a game of Chrononauts look like? I would say somewhat wild, somewhat excited, quite happy most of the time. Slight frustration here and there where you're basically trying to put events back and forth. This might mess other people's plans, but overall it will be a sense of strategy and enjoyment. Now, the artwork is fairly simple, but the artwork doesn't have to be anything more than simple in order to play the game. This game isn't sold on its artwork, it's sold on the gameplay, it's sold on the idea of it. Also, if you happen to be a fan of history, this game is a great avenue into the 20th century. If you are a particularly person of American persuasion, you will love the early American Chrononauts because basically it dials back throughout the 18th century and all the subsequent events there. There are, of course, more events. There are, of course, more fantastic things to collect. And the actual history involved is different. So, for example, you could travel back to the time of work beginning on the Panama Canal in 1904. You could be part of the Alaska Purchase. You might find certain events that could change things. For example, the Great Chicago Fire. Or alternatively, the fire could be doused and change history a different way. So, if you are an American person who loves their history, this gives you a massive boost in terms of your enjoyment for the game because it will feel especially personalised to you. Now, we're British and therefore are played as the baddies in every single American film ever. So while we appreciate the extension to the game, I suspect there's a lot of events here that don't mean as much to us as they would to other gamers, which is, of course, fair enough. We think it's a fun addition, there's more to add there, and we especially like in terms of the extra artifacts, the extra things to collect, the extra gameplay. That's a really fun element to us. But obviously that will appeal much more to an American market than a British market, or maybe a French or German or Canadian market, etc. So, Chrononauts. There's various different things about it you would like. There's various things that it does well. The question is it a game for you? Let's go to the final thoughts. All right, welcome back to this timeline and this reality. Who knows who I am right now? No, I'm just kidding, it's still me. Right, so, Chrononauts. What do we think of it as a game? In terms of the game itself, it is an intriguing proposition. The whole idea, the whole premise is good. It appeals to many people's love of sci-fi and time travel. Okay, good so far. In terms of artwork, this will not blow you away with artwork, but it was never intended to. It's a simple game made good, and it considerably does so in terms of what it offers, in terms of the gameplay, in terms of the depth, where possible. Strategy. Well, the strategy is fairly simple. You need to arrange the things to be in the way that you want them to be, or you need to collect the stuff. That's essentially it. So there's not exactly a massive range of victory conditions here that you can call upon here. If you do enjoy multiple routes of victory, for example in 5 Tribes, for example in Viceroy, this might not be for you, but it is a game that is definitely worth a shot. Now, do we enjoy it in our house? Yes, we do. Do we all enjoy it in our house? We do. It's harder to get started in 2-player, so we generally basically go around that by giving people a few more cards to get started, because it's either going to be one way or another with 2 players. So where this game really shines is in 3 and 4 players, where there's going to be multiple different ways to get going. There's going to be a nice variety of actual events happening place, rather than just, I want it this way, no, I want it that way. So for a 2 game, maybe not. You could technically play this solo, theoretically, but it'd be very, very difficult. So 3 to 4 players, you will enjoy this game. In terms of the depth and stretch of it, well, the expansions do add quite a lot, especially if you are American. I've said this before, but the early American Chrononauts will be lots of fun for fans of American history, one way or the other. And it will add a certain personal element to the game that will really make it shine and give it a new dimension, I think. Overall, Chrononauts gets a certain amount of player to our game. We do pull it out now and again. We do tend to enjoy it. And we do basically tend to have fun, whether we basically win or not. It's definitely a game that we like happening. We like joking about the alternative histories. We like collecting things. My son always likes to collect dinosaurs all the time. My wife's a Beatles fan, so she might try to pick up the Beatles fan. album. We certainly especially the idea that there are not one but three Mona Lisas in play. There's the real one, an obvious forgery, and a clever forgery. That's always gives us good laughs in terms of the game, in terms of how it pans out. So Chrononauts, yes, there is a big lot of laughs there. It's definitely a lot to entertain you, and also for a very, very low price point, you can pick this up without much difficulty whatsoever. So that's our thoughts. Hopefully we've managed to inspire you in a little bit of a different type of game, especially if you're not used to playing this type, and maybe pick it up or play it yourself. If you'd like to get in contact with us, as ever, please reach us at rogueartistcreations.com. You can find us on Facebook at Rogue Artist Creations. Our Twitter handle is at RogueACreations, and you can always find me, GMFirst, at rogueartistcreations.com. Thank you for joining us. Please keep spreading the word. We're kind of finding our stride here. We're sorting out a few focus issues, hopefully, and giving you some games that you might never have seen before. Coming up next, we have the amazing Betrayal at House on the Hill.